Most people remember the white dress scene more clearly than they remember the 7-year itch. They remember Marilyn Monroe standing above a subway grate, the pleated skirt rising high, her hands pressing it down while she smiles beneath the lights. But the most famous full-body photographs didn't come from the finished scene audiences watched in theaters. They came from a heavily publicized New York location shoot. The sequence used in the movie was later filmed again on a controlled Hollywood soundstage and framed more carefully. That difference changes the meaning of the image. The world didn't fall in love only with a moment from a film. It fell in love with publicity, a planned spectacle, a photograph removed from the dialogue, the character, and the comedy surrounding it. Once the image was separated from the scene, Marilyn Monroe's performance became easier to simplify. The dress rose, she smiled, the camera loved her. End of explanation. But nothing about that moment was as effortless as the photograph suggested. The fabric, lighting, repeated takes, press attention, and physical timing were all being managed around one performer. The photograph became larger than the film, and Marilyn Monroe's body became more famous than the acting choices that made the picture feel alive. So what was the world actually looking at? A lucky image, or a carefully built performance? If you want Marilyn Monroe's story told through authenticated photographs, studio records, and the performances themselves, not recycled mythology, please like this video and subscribe. Because the white dress wasn't simply caught by chance. It was designed, lit, repeated, photographed, and performed. And before we can understand the woman hidden behind that famous image, we have to begin with the dress itself, and the unnamed character Marilyn Monroe was asked to place inside it. This story isn't about claiming Marilyn Monroe secretly hated glamour, or that every photograph of her was false. She helped create the public image. She understood how costume, movement, expression, and camera angle could turn one brief moment into something unforgettable. The real problem came later. Hollywood treated that successful image as though it explained the entire woman. So we're going to follow the white dress from William Trevilla's design room to the midnight publicity shoot, the finished film, Marilyn Monroe's break with Fox, and the different costume choices she later made in Bus Stop. The question isn't whether Marilyn Monroe looked extraordinary in the dress, it's what the dress allowed Hollywood to ignore. And that story begins before the subway air ever lifted the skirt. Before the wind lifted the skirt, the dress had already been designed to attract the camera. Costume designer William Trevilla created it for Marilyn Monroe's role in the 7-year itch. Although it's usually remembered as pure white, the garment was closer to ivory. A pale cocktail dress with a plunging halter neckline, bare shoulders and back, a fitted waist, and a softly pleated skirt falling below the knee. Nothing about the shape was accidental. The halter top created a clean, instantly recognizable outline around Marilyn Monroe's face and shoulders. The wrapped waist drew attention toward the center of the body, and the pleated skirt divided the fabric into narrow folds that could open, close, and multiply even a small movement. Under strong lights, the pale material caught the camera clearly. When Marilyn Monroe turned, walked, or shifted her weight, the dress responded, and when moving air reached the skirt, the costume became part of the action. There's no reliable evidence that Marilyn Monroe personally designed the dress, and the credit belongs to Trevilla. But a costume doesn't perform by itself. It can shape the silhouette, guide the viewer's eye, and prepare the visual effect. The actor still has to understand how to stand inside it, how to move without fighting it, and how to make the construction feel natural rather than planned. That was the dress's real achievement. It was carefully designed to make preparation disappear. Simple enough to look like something worn on a warm summer evening, memorable enough to become the image used to sell the film, and the woman wearing it was playing a character Hollywood hadn't even bothered to give a proper name. In The 7-Year Itch, Marilyn Monroe's character is credited simply as the girl. She has no proper name, no detailed history, no clear life outside the apartment upstairs, and the married man who becomes fascinated by her. The story is largely filtered through Richard Sherman, played by Tom Ewell. With his wife and son away for the summer, Richard's imagination begins turning the young woman upstairs into temptation, danger, and proof of his own supposed desirability. Marilyn Monroe could have played that idea as pure seduction. Instead, she made the girl open, cheerful, and unexpectedly direct. She enjoys cold drinks, air conditioning, music, and small comforts without appearing to understand the elaborate fantasies Richard has built around her. When she speaks, the comedy often comes from the distance between what Richard imagines and what she actually means. That choice gives the character more humanity than the label allows. The dress tells Richard, and the audience, to see temptation. Marilyn Monroe's performance keeps introducing innocence, warmth, and humor into the same frame. She doesn't make the character unintelligent. She makes her less suspicious than the people projecting meaning onto her. That distinction matters. The girl remains limited by the way the film is written. Marilyn Monroe doesn't suddenly give her a complete hidden biography the screenplay never provides. But she gives the character behavior, a rhythm, a point of view inside the comedy. The result is a woman who feels more alive than the fantasy Richard keeps trying to place around her. Hollywood had given the character no name. Marilyn Monroe gave her presence. But presence was harder to sell than a photograph of the white dress rising above a subway grate. The cameras were not on Lexington Avenue by accident. During the early hours of September 15, 1954, the production brought Marilyn Monroe and Tom Ewell onto a Manhattan street to film the subway grate sequence. But this wasn't treated like an ordinary location scene. The moment had already been recognized as ideal publicity. Photographers were positioned around the working area. Powerful lights turned the street bright enough for filming. News of Marilyn Monroe's appearance spread, and a large crowd gathered beyond the crew and police barriers, waiting to see the white dress move. Beneath the grate, a technician operated a wind machine designed to imitate the rush of air from a passing subway train. Everything had to be coordinated. Marilyn Monroe stepped onto her mark. Tom Ewell stood nearby. The machine pushed air upward. The pleated skirt rose. Then the cameras captured the reaction. Inside the film, the moment was supposed to feel almost private. Two people leaving a movie theater on a warm night, pausing above a subway grate, and laughing at an unexpected breeze. On the street, nothing about it was private. Every lift of the dress was watched by the crew, the press, the photographers, and the spectators gathered around them. Each repetition gave the cameras another chance to freeze Marilyn Monroe's body at the most marketable instant. That doesn't mean Marilyn Monroe was simply powerless inside the spectacle. She was a professional completing a planned scene and working with the attention surrounding it. But the studio understood something clearly. A photograph of Marilyn Monroe's dress rising could advertise the 7-year itch faster than any explanation of the character or comedy. And each time the machine started again, Marilyn Monroe had to react as though she hadn't known it was coming. Looking surprised once was simple. Looking surprised again and again, while standing on the same mark, waiting for the same machine, and facing dozens of cameras, required control. The surviving footage shows Marilyn Monroe adjusting her feet over the grate before each burst of air. When the pleated skirt lifted, she bent her knees, raised her shoulders, and reached down to manage the fabric. Sometimes she looked toward Tom Ewell. Sometimes she turned toward the surrounding cameras and spectators. Then the air stopped. Marilyn Monroe lowered the dress, settled her posture, and prepared for the next attempt. The work had several moving parts. She had to remain positioned above the strongest airflow. She had to prevent the skirt from becoming completely unmanageable. She had to keep her face visible beneath the powerful lights. And she had to preserve the playful innocence of the girl, even though everyone on the street knew exactly when the machine would begin. A stiff response would have made the visual joke feel rehearsed. An exaggerated response could have made the character appear calculating. Marilyn Monroe found the space between them. The surprise appeared to reach her body in stages. The skirt lifted, her knees adjusted, her shoulders rose, and then the laughter arrived. That sequence gave the cameras time to capture a complete reaction, rather than one fixed pose. The famous still photographs remove all the preparations surrounding the instant. They don't show the waiting. They don't show the reset. They don't show Marilyn Monroe checking her position before the next burst of air. They show only the result, movement that appears effortless. But the most famous photographs weren't simply records of the scene audiences eventually watched. The publicity image would become larger, more revealing, and far more memorable than the moment preserved in the finished film. The image most people remember wasn't exactly the image audiences saw in the finished film. The famous full-body photographs came largely from the New York location shoot. The bright lights, the gathered spectators, and the repeated bursts of air above the subway grate. But the sequence used in The 7-Year Itch was later recreated, under controlled conditions on a Hollywood soundstage. The finished scene is more restrained than public memory suggests. Marilyn Monroe and Tom Ewell walk along the street after leaving a movie theater. Marilyn Monroe's character notices the cool air rising through the grate. The dress moves, she laughs, and the moment remains part of the conversation between them. The publicity photographs removed almost everything around it. No dialogue, no character relationship, no comic setup, no reminder that Marilyn Monroe was playing an unnamed woman whose innocence made Richard Sherman's fantasies look foolish. Once the photograph was separated from the scene, it could travel anywhere. Magazine pages, posters, calendars, advertisements. Later, sculptures, exhibitions, and countless reproductions. The film became secondary. Even the girl disappeared. What remained was Marilyn Monroe, the raised skirt, the white dress, and a smile that appeared to require no preparation. That simplified image was easier to remember than the complete performance. It also encouraged the belief that Marilyn Monroe's appeal happened naturally, that she merely stood in front of a camera and the image created itself. The dress was no longer functioning only as a costume. It had become a container for nearly everything the public expected Marilyn Monroe to represent. And Hollywood quickly learned that this simplified version of Marilyn Monroe could be sold almost anywhere. Marilyn Monroe had been learning how photographs worked long before the white dress reached Lexington Avenue. Her early modeling experience taught her that the camera didn't respond only to beauty. It responded to angles, posture, the direction of the eyes, the position of the shoulders, the difference between holding a smile and allowing one to appear. By 1949, photographs already documented Marilyn Monroe studying singing, dancing, and drama, while trying to build a film career. She wasn't waiting for a studio to discover a complete performer hidden inside her. She was training. Modeling added another kind of education. A still camera could preserve one fraction of a movement and make that instant stand for an entire personality. A small change in the chin, back, hands, or hips could produce a completely different impression. Marilyn Monroe carried that awareness into film. She knew how to create a readable silhouette. She understood how a slow turn could give the camera time to follow. She could soften her expression so that sexuality appeared mixed with uncertainty or humor, rather than cold calculation. That doesn't mean every pose was mechanically planned. Part of Marilyn Monroe's effectiveness came from combining preparation with emotional openness. The reaction looked immediate because she didn't allow the technique to remain visible. The public Marilyn Monroe was therefore neither a total studio invention nor a false mask covering an unrelated woman called Norma Jeane. Marilyn Monroe helped build that professional identity from her voice, appearance, humor, movement, vulnerability, and knowledge of the camera. The studio enlarged it. Photographers repeated it. Publicity departments distributed it. The conflict began when the image she had helped create was treated as the limit of what she was allowed to become. Marilyn Monroe could control how the dress moved during the photograph. She had far less control over what that photograph would be used to say about her. Marilyn Monroe could control how the dress moved for the camera. She couldn't control how often Hollywood would use that image to define what she was allowed to play. The white dress didn't create her typecasting by itself. It became the clearest symbol of a pattern that was already surrounding her career. Again and again, scripts asked for some version of the desired blonde, the innocent temptation, the woman whose effect on men mattered more than her own history, the glamorous figure who appeared in the story fully formed, without a past, a profession, or ambitions beyond the attention she attracted. The 7-Year Itch made that reduction unusually visible. Marilyn Monroe's character wasn't given a proper name. She existed in the credits as the girl, as though her function in Richard Sherman's imagination explained everything the audience needed to know. That didn't mean Marilyn Monroe rejected comedy, beauty, or glamour. She was exceptionally skilled at using all three. What she resisted was the assumption that success in those roles meant she should remain inside them forever. After filming ended, the white dress could be returned to wardrobe and placed on a hanger. Without Marilyn Monroe inside it, it couldn't laugh. It couldn't react to the moving air. It couldn't create the combination of innocence, sexuality, and comic timing that made the scene work. The meaning had come from her performance. Yet public memory increasingly treated the costume as though it had created Marilyn Monroe, rather than the other way around. The photograph became evidence of what Hollywood believed she should continue doing. By the time that image was spreading around the world, Marilyn Monroe was preparing to step outside the system that had made it. Within months of the Lexington Avenue shoot, Marilyn Monroe was no longer in Hollywood. She had moved east and begun working with photographer Milton H. Green on a plan that sounded far more serious than the carefree image still circulating in magazines. In January 1955, they publicly announced Marilyn Monroe Productions. Marilyn Monroe would serve as president. Forming a company didn't instantly free her from Fox. It didn't guarantee financing, distribution, or the ability to make any film she chose. The studio still controlled her existing contract, and a long negotiation remained ahead. But the announcement made her intention impossible to dismiss. Marilyn Monroe wanted stronger material. She wanted a meaningful voice in the directors and projects connected to her name. And she wanted the freedom to prove that the roles Hollywood kept assigning her represented only part of what she could do. The timing revealed the distance between the photograph and the woman inside it. While the white dress image presented Marilyn Monroe as spontaneous fantasy, Marilyn Monroe was meeting lawyers, organizing a company, studying acting, and challenging one of Hollywood's most powerful studios. She wasn't rejecting the screen identity she had helped create. She was refusing to let that identity become a professional cage. The struggle took time. Marilyn Monroe still needed the resources of a major studio, and Fox still had enormous power over the films available to her. But when they eventually reached a new agreement, Marilyn Monroe received better terms and meaningful approval over directors. Bus Stop became the first film made under that renegotiated relationship. And when Marilyn Monroe returned to the screen, she chose a costume that communicated almost the exact opposite of the white dress. This one would be worn, damaged, and visibly repaired. Marilyn Monroe returned to the screen in Bus Stop wearing a costume that communicated almost the opposite of the white dress. The pleated ivory dress from the 7-Year Itch had been clean, light, elegant, and designed to move beautifully. Sherry's nightclub costume was supposed to look used. The character worked in a small Phoenix saloon and dreamed of becoming a Hollywood star. She wanted to appear glamorous, but her clothing had to reveal that the dream was larger than her circumstances. Marilyn Monroe helped shape that difference. Sherry's makeup was unusually pale, suggesting a woman who worked at night and rarely saw daylight. Her famous platinum hair was softened into a less polished honey blonde shade. The stage costume looked tawdry and threadbare, rather than fresh from a studio wardrobe. Sequins and decorative details appeared worn. The hair looked untidy. The entire image suggested someone repeating the same nightclub act long after the costume had lost its original shine. Marilyn Monroe wasn't rejecting beauty. She was using appearance to explain character. Sherry wanted the audience inside the bar to believe she was glamorous enough for a larger stage. But the clothing, the strained singing, and the uncertain posture told a different story. That was the artistic decision. The white dress had made effort disappear. Sherry's costume made effort visible. One woman appeared naturally perfect beneath the lights. The other looked as though she had worked very hard to create an image that was beginning to fall apart. The contrast showed what Marilyn Monroe understood about costume. Clothing didn't merely make a performer attractive. It could reveal what a character wanted and how far she remained from having it. One dress made the world think it understood Marilyn Monroe. The next showed how deliberately Marilyn Monroe could make the camera see someone else. Marilyn Monroe didn't have to abandon glamour to prove she could act. She also didn't have to stop making people laugh. The white dress sequence worked because Marilyn Monroe played the reaction with comic innocence. The girl didn't appear to understand the full effect she was having on Richard Sherman, or on the audience watching her. That gap created the joke. Marilyn Monroe understood more than the character appeared to understand. 4 years later, Some Like It Hot asked her to use a similar quality in a richer role. Sugar Cane was glamorous, musical, hopeful, and repeatedly disappointed by the men she trusted. Marilyn Monroe made her funny without making her emotionally empty. The performance depended on listening, a delayed glance, a soft change in the voice, the exact moment a hopeful expression weakened into embarrassment. Sugar could make a joke about her past and still allow the hurt beneath it to remain visible. That balance required precision. The production difficulties are part of the record. Marilyn Monroe struggled with lines, arrived late, and required repeated takes. Those problems placed real pressure on Billy Wilder, Tony Curtis, Jack Lemmon, and the crew. They shouldn't be erased, but neither should the finished performance. Difficulty before the camera and skill in the completed scene could exist at the same time. Marilyn Monroe gave Sugar warmth and vulnerability strong enough to become the film's emotional center, even while Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis carried much of the faster farce around her. In 1960, she won the Golden Globe for leading actress in a musical or comedy. That award didn't prove the work came easily. It proved comedy wasn't evidence against her seriousness. Hollywood saw the white dress clearly. It was slower to recognize the intelligence required to make the woman inside it feel alive. Years later, the white dress stopped being only a film costume. It became an artifact. It passed through private collections, appeared in exhibitions, inspired copies, and was reproduced in posters, advertisements, costumes, and sculpture. In 2011, it was sold from Debbie Reynolds' collection for millions of dollars. The price showed how valuable the object had become. But displaying the dress without Marilyn Monroe also reveals what the object cannot do. On a mannequin, the pleated skirt remains still. The shoulders don't rise. The knees don't adjust when the air begins. No hand reaches for the fabric. No expression changes from surprise to laughter. The garment preserves the outline. It doesn't preserve the performance by itself. William Travilla created a costume that could respond beautifully to light, movement, and air. Billy Wilder built the comic situation. The studio and photographers turned the location shoot into publicity. But Marilyn Monroe made the parts connect. Without her timing, the dress was fabric. Without her expression, the gust was only a mechanical effect. Without her understanding of the camera, the photograph might have been revealing without becoming funny, warm, or memorable. The costume deserves preservation, because costume design helps create character. But the dress has sometimes received more serious attention than the acting choices that brought it to life. That is the final limitation of the object. It can preserve Marilyn Monroe's silhouette. It cannot preserve her judgment, timing, humor, or control, unless the viewer returns to the moving images. The surviving costume can preserve the shape of the symbol. Only the film preserves the woman working inside it. The white dress doesn't prove that Marilyn Monroe hated glamour. It doesn't prove every public smile was false. It doesn't prove that Norma Jeane and Marilyn Monroe were two completely separate women, one real and one invented. And it doesn't prove that Hollywood created her success without her participation. The surviving record shows something more complicated. William Travilla designed a costume that responded beautifully to light, movement, and air. Billy Wilder placed that costume inside a visual joke. The studio recognized the publicity value. Photographers waited for the instant when the skirt rose high enough to become unforgettable. But Marilyn Monroe supplied the timing. She controlled the movement of her body inside the dress. She adjusted her feet, shoulders, hands, and expression so the reaction remained playful rather than mechanical. She understood how to keep the character innocent, while the image around her became increasingly sexualized. Marilyn Monroe helped create the moment. Then she fought against allowing that moment to define the limits of her career. That distinction matters. She wasn't simply a victim trapped inside an image other people invented. She was a skilled participant in the image's creation, one who later asked for stronger material, greater professional authority, and the freedom to show more than the image could contain. Place the white dress beside Sherry's worn nightclub costume. Add an actor's studio attendance sheet, a Marilyn Monroe Productions document, a marked script. Together, those objects tell a fuller story. The white dress represents camera instinct, comic timing, and an extraordinary ability to make a constructed moment feel spontaneous. The other objects represent study, judgment, ambition, and resistance to professional limitation. Hollywood wasn't wrong to recognize that Marilyn Monroe could make the dress unforgettable. It was wrong when it treated that achievement as the full measure of her ability. The final meaning of the white dress appears only after Marilyn Monroe steps out of it. Now the dress hangs quietly in a wardrobe room. There's no wind beneath it, no crowd gathered outside, no flash bulbs, no studio lights turning ivory fabric into something almost luminous. Without Marilyn Monroe inside it, the pleated skirt remains still. Across the room, Marilyn Monroe sits in simple rehearsal clothes, with an open script resting in her hands. Her hair is partly covered. There's no carefully arranged pose. No one is asking her to stand above a subway grate or recreate the smile that appeared on posters around the world. She reads a line, stops, changes the emphasis, makes a small note in the margin, then begins again. The glamorous costume and the working actor aren't enemies. Both belong to Marilyn Monroe. The dress represents her rare ability to understand movement, comedy, costume, and camera well enough to create an image audiences never forgot. The open script represents everything that image couldn't show: preparation, professional judgment, frustration, ambition, the need to be taken seriously without surrendering the qualities that had made her successful. The white dress didn't hide a completely different woman. Public certainty did. The image became so familiar that people stopped asking how it had been made, who had made it work, and what else the performer inside it was trying to become. Marilyn Monroe wasn't absent from the famous photograph. She was there in every controlled movement and carefully timed reaction. But she was larger than the instant the camera preserved. The dress made Marilyn Monroe unforgettable. The woman who stepped out of it was still preparing for her next scene.